On the PlayStation 2, there was a trio of animated action platformer franchises that garnered a large following. They were Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, and Ratchet and Clank. The three of these franchises sat together in harmony, but when the PlayStation 3 came around in late 2006, two of these franchises, unfortunately, struggled to move on to the new system, and now seemingly lie abandoned as their developers moved on to new projects. But not Ratchet and Clank. While Naughty Dog and Sucker Punch moved on to bigger things, Insomniac never left Ratchet and Clank behind. They kept going with the series, and today its popularity is absolutely huge. Now look, I don't blame Naughty Dog or Sucker Punch for doing what they did, but I'm glad that Insomniac was able to keep their dynamic duo relevant through the HD era. In fact, not only did they keep the franchise going, but they did a damn good job of it too. It's easy for a franchise to get stale and mediocre when it's as old as Ratchet and Clank is. But the truth is that aside from a couple of stumbling blocks, even the recent Ratchet and Clank games are very good. Of course, the original trilogy is amazing, and the later PS2 games were pretty decent, but the Ratchet and Clank Future Trilogy, the first Ratchet and Clank games on the PlayStation 3, were arguably just as good, and some may even say better than the original trilogy of games. And after that, Insomniac made a couple of weird spin-offs that were, they weren't horrible, but they're not up to the typical Ratchet and Clank standards. But, soon enough, they got back on track with Into the Nexus. And even though that game was really short, I still loved the hell out of it. And the only complaint I had is that I wished it was longer because I thought it was quite a good game. And the 2016 quote-unquote reboot game sold amazingly well. And while some more hardcore fans weren't happy with the game's jumble of a story and the different take it had on the dynamic duo, you gotta admit that the game did sell very well. And there are definitely worse games in the Ratchet and Clank series than the 2016 reboot. I mean, even if you're not a fan of the 2016 game, you still gotta admit that there are definitely worse games. So then, that brings us to today. It's been a long 3 years as we've waited for a new game. Now look, I know what you're thinking. I've already made videos about the other two PS2 classic franchises, Jak and Daxter and Sly Cooper, and while those videos have a pretty dire and cynical outlook, don't worry, because this video is not like those other two. This is not a games that never existed video. This is something different. And I'm actually very hopeful for the future of Ratchet and Clank, because I know that Insomniac is not done with it yet. And I know they're not going to leave it by the wayside like so many other game franchises before it. And I know that it may look bad. I mean, after all, this is the longest stretch we've had without a game release, or at least a trailer. Now, yes, I know there were 3 years between Into the Nexus and 2016's Ratchet and Clank, just like there is between 2016 and right now, but the thing is, we knew the 2016 game was coming. Insomniac wasn't exactly hiding anything. Now, despite this information and it being a large gap between the games, I do think that Insomniac is working on a new game. I think that this time they're just being a little bit more careful and tight-lipped with it. Let me explain why I think this. I really started to get this idea after reading an Insomniac interview from March 2018. In this interview, one of Insomniac's game directors discussed the history of the Ratchet and Clank series and talked about the lessons that they had learned after the release of each game. What Insomniac had found was that their fans loved the original formula for Ratchet and Clank, and found that whenever they tried to change the formula, like say with Ratchet Deadlocked, which was more of a stripped-down arena shooter versus like the more free-form platformer of before, that was... Now, Deadlocked was a good game, but it's not quite what fans were expecting. Insomniac said that Deadlocked was a mistake, and so with the Ratchet and Clank Future series, they returned to the classic formula and ended up having amazing success, as the future games are some of the best in the series. Furthermore, Insomniac talked about how All for One and Full Frontal Assault were decent, but once again, it's not what the fans wanted. So, Into the Nexus was a much more classic Ratchet and Clank game, but unfortunately ended up being too short. And the 2016 movie tie-in reboot game once again returned to the Ratchet and Clank formula of old that we all know and love, and the game sold amazingly well. So the thing that Insomniac really learned from all of this is that they have to stick to their tried and true formula, while also embracing new trends and adapting to new ideas. Now, when discussing the Ratchet and Clank 2016 game, they said, quote, "We took all the lessons we'd learned over the entire series and improved the game and brought it up to date." End quote. So I honestly think, based on this interview, that Insomniac is carefully trying to plot their way forward from here and make the best new Ratchet and Clank game that they possibly can, keeping the classic game DNA intact while also trying to make the series feel new and alive again. I'm excited to see what they have in store, because I feel like it's something really, really big. And that's honestly probably why it's taking so long, because Insomniac realized that they have to take their time and slow down with the sequels in order to find true success. Furthermore, another thing that motivates me greatly is a little bit of a rumor that I heard about from a former IGN editor, Colin Moriarty, who said on a podcast recently that, quote, "You haven't seen the last of Ratchet and Clank on PS4, end quote." Now look, okay, is what he said guaranteed to be true? Of course it's not. It's always best to take hearsay like this with a grain of salt. However, when Moriarty was at IGN, he led IGN's PlayStation division and ended up accumulating many sources within Sony, such as its first-party studios and the studios it works with, like Insomniac. So basically, Moriarty has his sources and may possibly even know someone inside of Insomniac that he's getting this information from. And also, supposedly, he really isn't someone that usually throws around rumors unless they have substantial backing to them. So yes, while we can't confirm 100% that there's another Ratchet and Clank game coming soon, I still think that the future looks bright for the series, especially when you compare it to the other two game IPs that I mentioned earlier, whose futures unfortunately look very dire. So for once, it seems I can actually end a video on a positive note. That's like totally new for me, honestly. Everything I've talked about up to this point has been pretty damn negative, but you can bet that when a trailer drops for the next Ratchet and Clank game, whenever that may be, I'll definitely be there for sure. As always, if you enjoy my content and want to hear more about any of the games I've discussed, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out.